Väike sissejuhatus Deimantase tausta kohta on, et Deimantas on Leedu kunstnik, ta elab ja töötab Vilniuses. Ta on tegelikult treenitud skulptorina, aga põhiliselt kasutab meediumitena filmi ja videot. Ja sellised dokumentaalkaadrid ja intervjuud ja taaslavastused ja fotod on väga nagu oluline osa tema sellisest praktikast. Ja ta väga palju tegelikult tegeleb sellise nõukogude kollektiivse mäluga või sellise justkui sükse Balti identiteediga ka, et welcome, Deimantas. I will include you now to the conversation. Maybe just to say a few words also in English about the exhibition. Observing Power is basically dealing with the notion of power through 5 or 4 different layers. So first of all, taking architecture as a manifestation of power or a political ideology, or as a monument of representing something. And then the power of a photographer or an artist who deals with a camera and manipulates with the perspective or approach towards the architecture. Then a power of a curator, who in that case is me, who takes the freedom to recontextualize the material which has been in my hand. And then fourth, it would be the power of the observer or the audience, who the gaze of the audience and the background the audience brings to the exhibition. And maybe just a few words about the work which Deimantas is showing at the exhibition is once in 20th century, and it's a video of Vilnius National TV material from 91, when Lenin Monument was removed from its location and filmed from 2 point of views, if I remember correctly. And Deimantas has kind of taken the material apart and re-edited the material so that the impression you get from the video is that the monument is not removed but placed back on its position. Deimantas, can you please say a few words how this work came about?
Yeah. Sorry. Hello to everyone whom I haven't said hello yet. And actually, this work was commissioned by for a group exhibition at Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam. And this exhibition was called Time and Again, and it was dedicated for the 15 years anniversary of the Berlin Wall fall. So it was midway since now. I mean, it was already kind of first reflections to this last decade and all 15 years. And I was one of those artists who was invited there, and I thought how to reflect on this back in 2004. And I chose this material of the event which I had attended back in 1991. I wasn't filming then, but I was then, as a student, going back from academy to the location where I was living, and it was on my way. And I stayed there for 4 hours. And I joined this kind of event, and I waited what it will be. And I think a lot of people, which you can see in the video, basically were expecting what will happen when they remove this monument. And actually, when the legs came off from the pedestal of Lenin, I thought it will never happen in 1,000 years. It was very emotional for everyone, and it was very peaceful at the same time, but it was kind of progression in a lot of, not everyone's, but in a lot of people's minds, that that happens things unimaginable in a way. And 15 years later, I thought I have to revisit or rethink this particular moment. And I created this video with the material from national TV, as you correctly indicated. Also one enthusiast who also filmed the event. So basically just practically to get more footage, be able to recreate. And for me, the thing is not that Lenin is coming back, but it's about the main protagonist of this video is crowd, you know. And I already back 2004 thought that the crowd is the feeling free completely. They are occupying the public space, which up till then was completely prohibited, or kind of prohibited. You know, nobody was really relaxed in the former square of Lenin for 50 years, you know. So, yeah, and also this reversing footage is about the cinema, about experiment, and about the fictionalization of the fact. And, you know, like, you probably know that the film by called October. It's a reflection of 10 years October Revolution in Russia, and you know, like this very famous film, it's depicting events not of October Revolution but of February Revolution, which was bourgeois revolution in a way. So I mean, yeah. So there are several layers as well: cinematic layer, personal layer. Layer of dealing with public space and transformation. Yeah, that's it, I think, for now.
Yeah, I was just looking at the video today again in the exhibition space, and it's what I really like that the work itself is actually very delicate. The way you have handled the material, there could easily be an effect where you watch the video and you understand immediately that the shots are reversed or flipped, or you've actively violated them. But no, it's very delicate, and as you say, it's a dialogue between the crowd and the statue, and I'm even wondering if there are maybe an audience member walking in the exhibition space, and people, at least for local people, these images of Lenin statue attached to the crane is immediately, you see it and you immediately know what is going on. So I'm wondering if some people don't have the patience to stay a bit longer. They would expect it's another video where we see the statue being removed, but just basically the act of reversing the whole, or re-editing, and actually the statue returning to its place, it makes the whole difference. And of course, it's extremely interesting how the history is going in circles, and now in Western world, this whole dialogue, the conversation around the removing statues and everything is very, very, very actual. But maybe meanwhile, now I would show a little clip of the video, just as a little teaser for the ones who haven't seen it yet. Let's see. I was just before a little bit saying a few words how it felt for me to work with the archive material for this exhibition, and what a shift it was for me to not produce images myself, but to actually reuse images by other people. So somehow the idea of like manipulating with other people's memories. But then in your case is you were actually present at the event. So these shots could be yours, but they're not yours. So there's even more kind of nuance in this whole situation. Can you a little bit say like what kind of, how do you experience this idea of working with an archive as a kind of a document or as a collective memory, and then like so actively just manipulating with this?
Well, thank you for this question. Well, the using of archive, it comes from my other practice, basically from a sculptural practice, when I was using ready-made for my installations and objects in site-specific situations. So to me, it was kind of sort of Dadaist approach to existing footage, and involving existing footage into kind of creative process and kind of recharging with the political or social context of you know, like taking away political weightness or bringing new context. And I think this is kind of, you know, like decontextualization as it is with ready-made. So I was this approach towards, I mean, at the beginning, when I started to work with archive, I was looking for the object, which was moving image, how to relocate this and to give another context. And this is a good example. And later I was working with quite a few archives. I worked with the Bundesarchiv for Münster 2007. And I did work with BFI archive, which is huge. It's the second largest archive in the world. And you know, like later, like after producing several working with existing footage, I was receiving, you know, like question which you haven't asked me yet, but it was often coming during the conversations and presentations. Oh, but you are using somebody else's footage, and you know, like indeed, this is like we are using, but honestly, sometimes maybe not this particular footage which I made for once in the 20th century, but in other cases, if I wouldn't use this footage, probably this footage would be laying for another decades unused. We have to imagine, and this is like also in a way ethical, but I wouldn't say ideological, but ethical position, that at some point I thought that there's already too much or too many images produced in the world. Why we should produce new and new ones? And you know, because there's so much of information laying down somewhere, we just can use it and I mean get access, of course legally and so on. But you know, it's a kind of, again, Dadaist approach. You know, like there's so many massively produced non-arty objects which can be art. So this is what I thought about moving image as well. And I even haven't thought that it would come internet as the source, when now is so many images on internet, and already it's different digital kind of approach, our post-digital approach of images. Nobody even cares now anymore who is this or that image if they found on internet. And so it's kind of issue of found images from the archive being kind of publicly accessible on the kind of digitalized I wouldn't say wasteland, but on the digital kind of, on the internet, basically. Digital ocean.
Yeah, that's a lot of interesting points there. And this kind of Dadaist approach that, yeah, working with moving image as objects or as cultures, as I previously, I kept on telling myself that I'm happy that I'm working with images or moving images or digital images, because there's already so much waste in the world, physical objects, that if I would be a sculptor or an installation artist, I would just produce more and more physical objects, and we don't need this. But then I'm doing these abstract pixels, and of course this is completely doesn't make any sense, because now I'm aware of all this kind of a digital waste and how this is being stored somewhere in like physical huge hard drives anyway somehow. But then I would ask you a question which I was asked today by the national television, and I tried to say something, but you have a long history with this. If you have archive in front of you, and sometimes bigger and sometimes less big, but like how do you go about it? Like where to start? It's like enormous amount of material. Do you already know what you're gonna searching? You know what you're searching for, or you start to just like look with an open eyes? Or
right, so I would probably talk about two cases, like working with very big archives. So both cases I already mentioned. Like one is like when I was working for Münster 2007, and I went to Bundesarchiv and also other private archive in Berlin. And they are huge, and but I had a very particular, search kind of tag. So Karl Marx monument in Chemnitz. So then the whole material came out. I just had to make agreements and use it. And well, and also I had help of Münster Sculpturenprojekt 2007 office, and they did help a lot. So I had only 5 weeks. So I managed to make a film. But this is like then you search of particular image. Even there's a lot of image, but you know what they're looking for. And then I was like invited by BFI, British Film Institute, which is huge archive, and the sections, and also the physical films. And sometimes you have to watch physical films because they're not digitalized. And the archive itself is like 2 hours, way outside London, and then you receive, like old-fashioned kind of notebooks, which are like handwritten books, where it's like a few lines about the one or another reel. Basically, oh, this is like a reel from GDR from '81. And there is like the woman is kind of approaching a monument for the Soviet soldiers. She's laying there a flower, and then there's a group of people behind, some kids among them, and this kind of like kind of descriptions. Or sometimes when this kind of film is coming from Mongolia or Vietnam or Cuba, it's even more bizarre descriptions, And then, I also was commissioned to reflect on the 20 years fall of the Berlin Wall. And like, it's kind of, it's like, no, and the footage from former, let's say, socialist or communist world, I think was about 15,000 on film, on 16 or 35 millimeter, including feature films, documentary films, a few of TV programs, and then, voila, you're free to use it, like whatever you want. So basically, to be honest, sometimes I read all the descriptions. There was, for I think almost a month, I was reading these notebooks and making my own notes. And then I was going to, I forgot the name of this little town where this where is a hangar of British Film Institute Film Archive, and like I was kind of given Steinbeck, this sort of editing for 35 and 16 millimeter, and I, like analog monitor, and I'm watching this, and somebody was giving with the white gloves, the, like reel and so on. And yeah, basically institution and good luck. When you receive footage and you watch it, and then you ask to digitalize, because that was the purpose, to involve artists from overseas, as they tell, to approach this ITV archive, which is dedicated to the former communist world, as they say. And yeah, to make a work. And I think, honestly, it's not that particularly known work, but that work using kind of vague, very personalized descriptions, but also using kind of intuition in a way, and a luck. I would say I produced the work Into the Unknown, which is about 20 minutes of the GDR footage and some voiceovers from a Czech film, Into the Void, which is about dealing with art practices, dealing with psychiatric patients in the 60s Czech Republic. I mean, before 68 events, when they are really, really free, as the film practice in, as the film of Czechoslovakia at that time. And yeah, so I think I produced most interesting work. It's one of my favorite works. Yeah, so this kind of two approach, one very transparent light when you look for the footage with the particular theme, and another is totally improvisational, I would say, and you don't know what the outcome would be. And you're approaching films you never heard about, and areas you never heard about. So the only one thing, I kind of restricted myself to the area, to the GDR, I think most extreme socialist form in Europe. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. I had a similar experience in Kiev archive in Ukraine, that they had these notebooks, and it was also in Russian, and I had to translate who helped me to navigate through these descriptions, and you had to trust the descriptions, and then I didn't have a chance to order these reels to actually look at then what I had chosen, but I already had to order films based on description, and I already had to pay for it as well. And of course, I was also an artist from overseas, so a lot of money was asked for what I didn't see even before. I had to trust that the description is something accurate, or something it turns out to be interesting or something. But it's quite an interesting way to work, for sure. But then, do you feel some kind of a responsibility when working with archival material, that it's somehow material which people consider as a document, and then that you turn it into something else, or you relocate it in another context, or how do you feel about it?
Well, I think I am responsible, but the responsibility is basically artistic responsibility. Like you have to produce, like a convincing recontextualization of that and that archival material. So back in the 2000s, there were some curators and quite a few artists and theoreticians kind of approach an archive as such, as the kind of theoretical subject. And there were big exhibitions, including Venice Biennale, and where the archive as such was kind of presented in a very kind of sort of dominant, vast sort of entity. And archive, as like the art curators like Hans-Ulrich Oblist or Massimiliano Gioni, especially Massimiliano Gioni, I think, when he did Venice Biennale, so he used huge parts of archive. And for them, in a way, archive is something that human brain cannot afford to kind of understand anymore. something larger, than, this is something larger, what humanity had produced, larger than humanity can understand right now. It's kind of a metaphor, but also a physical presence of something in, utopian and impossible to kind of understand and so on, in a way like the discovery of archaeological object, when you need a lot of effort to understand what kind of object it is and for what it was used back 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. So, but for me, the archive, I was not that interested. It's an interesting position, archive as the impossibility of human to understand of its own deeds or whatever, its own activities. For me, as archive is a subject, I would say, like another person, which I don't know, who was a filmmaker or a cameraman or a sound man, to kind of engage and to start a dialogue and to kind of understand his or her position when they were creating this footage some decades ago, and really to kind of start to imagine that era, what they are working on, and kind of find something, maybe to give another meaning to something they already thought it's important, but not neglecting their importance they were giving to that or other subject they were filming. So it's a kind of, like, okay, that is important what you did years ago. Even I found it in dust on the shelves of some archive. But there is also and that is important as well. And I think this is like respect to what was filmed, and but also ability to give another view or kind of another perspective on what was created. And that is probably a professional responsibility, I would say, at least how I was understanding that back 10, 15 years ago when I started to approach archival materials.
Yeah, that's very nice. I also always think of a camera. It can be turned into a weapon, or it can turn into a love letter. And then just thinking about using other people's material as a kind of a homage for what has been done, and the kind of appreciation and elevation. Like you said, otherwise a lot of material would go into a dust, but then it has been highlighted. I have, in the context of the exhibition, I play a lot with an idea, architecture as power, or a manifestation of power, or a carrier of political ideas, or different ideologies. What do you think of an idea of like architecture as archive, or a cityscape as an atlas, or architecture atlas, or even a single architectural building as an archive somehow?
Well, architectural building of a certain era or a certain period is not an archive. It's still kind of functional house or an object. And of course it carries certain aesthetical, possibly, basically aesthetical value and so on. And the formation of the city landscapes, especially during the particular eras, is a little bit another, I think, or theme, subject, I would say. I had to deal with that as well, with my other work, and to be in some discussions as well, and how, like, let's say, post-regime city landscape affects a life of the city and the perception of the recent or distant past, especially when there's a generation of people who have no direct access to that period or something. And I think in that way we turn to kind of general post-colonial issues, with how architecture, monuments, shape our understanding or our current sort of identities with the historical traumas or historical interpretations in a different way it was. So I think it's in general falls into post-colonial or colonial issues. And with the, I think, well, there are differences, but also there are similarities between, I think, Estonian and Lithuanian past. And the most similarities are concerning the second part of 20th century. I think that is the only period when both current countries were the one state, I think. Well, there were some periods as well, but they are very distant and very violent, I guess, in the 14th century and whatever, in Livonian times. And but anyway, this is like something we can kind of easily still reflect, and where is the more similarities. And I think monuments and architectural monuments and sculptural monuments of that period is a subject of interpretation of your recent past, and kind of creation or set of narrative, how we kind of deconstruct this past and how deconstruct collective memories, how we deconstruct collective memories of certain groups, let's say of certain groups in terms of age, certain groups in terms of language, maybe, especially I think in Estonian context. In Lithuanian it's not that urgent, I think, anymore. But anyway, there are groups of people in the society which differently interprets, and sometimes radically differently interprets, one or another object. So that is post-colonial or neo-colonial issue. And I think as I started back in '89 as a visual artist, even I was still a student, '93 already, there was kind of understanding, basically coming from, I would say more like South European, former East or former communist countries, basically former Yugoslavia states, because they went into the war. So it was, the thought was very much radicalized. And also the communism or socialism they had in the 70s and 60s was much more liberal. So there was kind of, I think the mid-90s was very much catalyzed by curators, artists of Croatia, Serbia, Slovenia, and especially the curator and theorist Igor Zabel, who really created these terms like former East and former West. And of course, he mainly was talking about art practices in the Slovenian context and former Yugoslavian context. But actually, he, in a nice way, kind of bring up the issue of post-colonialism, and especially addressing conceptual minimalist practices in former Yugoslavia and former Czechoslovakia, making attention, which is basically later developed by Transit as the organization, that some practices in that region were in a way ahead of the practices in Italy, for example, or France, and they were, like Kozeridge as a sculptor was dealing the inner spaces some years earlier than Bruce Naumann's, negative chair space, and these examples. But in a way, it is also an issue of colonialism in a way to ask, where is the center, or where was the center? It's all about thought, not the institutional power. Yeah, so it's a discourse to that what we see as the city objects, as the monuments and architecture, in a way, it's our way we look to the past in the terms how we deconstruct the colonial past.
It's a perfect answer for my last question, actually, which was the initial trigger to also for the conversation to have here. When I sent you the invitation to be part of the show, I also included the curatorial statement, and your feedback was also targeting or was touching on a point how you feel that your generation would have handled this kind of material with more caution, let's say, the material of the archive or of maybe the modernist era mostly. And then you are also a professor in Vilnius Art Academy, so you probably see a lot of students and their way of handling Soviet past. Like, can you talk a bit about what are the generational differences?
No, I mean, even the same, thank you for this question, which is kind of a bit of relief of this kind of heavy introduction I did with the previous question. So like the students of mine, when they're kind of coming back to the, let's say, early 90s or very late 80s, which kind of for them is also this transition, start of the transition time of what they think and which they haven't experienced because they are born already after, let's say, they're born in the 90s. And you know, like the certain terms mean difference when we talk about restoration. They say, oh, it's about restoration of TV footage of the Berlin clubbing of the late 80s or something, you know, like the footage of all kind of tape recorded performances of some, you know, DJs of the early 90s, you know. So when we think about restoration, we think about buildings and the artworks, and they think sometimes about the media they kind of relate. That is restoration, you know, like, and also, you know, like, if we, you know, like talk about the architecture, so that one of my students are making drawings with the chalk and Vaseline, yeah, I think. Basically making kind of gloomy drawings and of the imaginable spaces which were used as the early clubbing scene in Berlin, but also she's transforming how it could happen in the 90s in Vilnius. You know, and she said like, oh, it's a dark sort of wave music scene, I can't imagine. So this is how they reflect on the past, which was completely differently reflected by, I think, my generation, and the tasks were completely different. So I think we cannot look back to what we were kind of, I think, extracting from that period, because basically, maybe Estonian historians did not agree with me, but honestly, when as a student, when I started to join international art scene back in the very early 90s, there was not a such thing and on the international art scene as Lithuania or probably Estonia, you know. We were a totally white spot, you know, and within few years, I thought we have to reinstall as a cultural area on the map in a way by acting. And this is like you cannot do this right away, you know, like you have to reflect, you know, and especially after first exhibitions internationally, I was started to, you know, we asked questions, oh, you do this and that, but what is the theoretical background, you know, what do you refer and what is written about that and how is reflected what you do? And this all had to be invented really within, I would say, a decade. And only back late after 95, 96, I started to reflect on the recent past, being completely aware that reflection of the recent past, in a way, it's reshaping of recent past or giving away of the presence, but with the reflection on the past. Basically, make a very clear distance for what at that time was called post-Soviet art. Because, you know, all these shadows of Kabakov and, you know, like very strong presence of what was created as the post-Soviet art with the huge exhibitions created in the early 90s up to mid 90s. I thought personally we have to create a distance from that, but also not neglecting a recent past.